1, 2, 3. We hit 10,000 subscribers recently. I did a community post where I said in celebration for 10,000 subscribers, I would do a Q&A video. And that's what I decided to do. And even though it's only been a couple of days, it feels a little late because between then and now, we've gotten to over 13,000. And I think maybe by the time this video goes live, we could be closer to 14, maybe even 15,000. So first of all, man, I just have to thank everybody. This channel has grown really, really fast. I never expected to have more than a few thousand subscribers after a lot of work, but it seems that people have responded really positively, or at least most people have been positive. I'm learning that you have to ignore some of the comments that get posted on your videos. A couple of the questions that were asked were about me. I'm a fairly private person, so I'm not going to talk about any thing that's like a family detail or anything like that. No one really asked those kinds of questions. I'm just kind of drawing a line. But one of the questions that came up a lot was my educational background. A few people asked what I was getting my PhD in, and there's just a slight misconception in that question. I have a PhD. I'm no longer in academia. I left because there aren't many great academic jobs. I didn't feel like I was likely to get one. I found a good job in industry, etc. So I left. But I have a PhD. I earned it in 2019, and it was in philosophy. It was in philosophy of language and logic, though I published a little bit on philosophical theology as well. I have a lot of philosophical interest. Logic and language are probably not my primary interest anymore, even though that's what I was writing my dissertation on, and it's what I've published in as well. And probably if I'd stayed in academia, I would have done maybe more theology stuff, sort of philosophical theology, analytic theology, something along this. But I have a lot of interest, and there's a good chance I would have gone more into the history of philosophy, including one interest that I never got to pursue that I still think would be worth doing was working on medieval logic and working on the history of logic in the medieval period. People also asked about the process of getting a PhD. The truth is, it's just a lot of work and it just takes a long time. I was in graduate school for 6 years. I actually feel like I ended a little fast. In fact, I ended a little early because I had an industry job waiting for me. That's not the norm. I know lots of people who take 8 or 9 years. I kind of wish I'd taken a little more time sometimes. At the same time, I feel very proud of the work that I did. I think that you learn a lot of good habits in graduate school. However, going through a long PhD process also sort of prevents you from entering fully into adulthood in a lot of ways. I was waiting to have kids. I didn't get married until the very end of my PhD program, stuff like that. You just put a lot of stuff off. And so once you get out of graduate school, if you don't also enter into the academic world, you can actually feel like you're a few years behind all of your peers, which is a bit of a weird feeling, but one I've come to terms with. And as for why I chose to study philosophy, that was pretty simple. I majored in philosophy because I thought it would make me more intelligent, and I thought it would be impressive, and I thought people would think I was smart. I chose my major in as an undergrad for very bad, selfish, non-virtuous reasons. That said, it turned out that I just really liked it. It turned out also that philosophy is really good at convincing you that you are not as intelligent as you thought you were, in a actually really virtuous way. I walked into my first couple of philosophy classes thinking I was the next Plato, and then I had all of my knowledge of the world basically torn away from me, and I had to work on rebuilding it in some fashion. Philosophy is just one of the coolest disciplines. I think everyone should study at least a little bit of philosophy, though I should say I don't know if I could go back in time if I would actually study philosophy again. I have a few other interests that I think maybe I would have been better suited for. That said, you can't get too lost in that kind of thinking. The truth is, I am now a person who did years and years of advanced research and scholarship, and has an advanced education in philosophy, one of the world's oldest disciplines. And I am so thankful that I was able to do that. And what an opportunity. right? To have years where I could just read and teach and write. What a wonderful thing to have. Someone asked me two very good questions. One of them was to describe my own philosophical beliefs and commitments. And the other one was my view on the analytic continental split in philosophy. Let me do the second one first. The analytic continental split is a real split. I think people who deny that it's a real split are engaging in some wishful thinking. That said, it is not such a split that it could not possibly be overcome. I myself have benefited and learned from a lot of philosophers that would kind of fall on the continental side, even though I am by training and by a lot of dispositions an analytic philosopher. I still think Heidegger's Being in Time is a masterpiece, and that is quintessentially a work of continental philosophy. I think someone like Alistair MacIntyre, who wrote one of my favorite books, After Virtue, that book does not neatly fit into analytic philosophy either, and yet it's great. I'm also trying to read more Hegel in the future, and that's tough and not typically part of an analytic philosopher's repertoire, but I'm working on it. My view basically is that what is going to happen is that you need to have more critical engagement from both continental philosophers and analytic philosophers. And that as that critical engagement happens, we'll find new commonalities as well. And that will also possibly open up new interesting lines of inquiry. We're all after fundamentally the same thing, which is to better understand ourselves in the world. And we're all trying to figure out what's true. And so the way I see it, we should be drawing from as many sources and methodologies as we can, and at least trying to figure out where those opposing methodologies and sources go wrong, if only because that will make us, just a little bit better at what it is that we're trying to do ourselves. As for my own philosophical beliefs, I don't have as many as you might think because I sort of tried to train myself to not have them unless I had arguments for them or reasons. There is a big exception to that, though, and people have kind of figured this out based on some of the content, and I've mentioned it in passing, but it's not a focus of this channel, and I don't plan on ever making it a focus of this channel. I'm a Christian. I attend an Eastern Orthodox church, and being part of that tradition or being a Christian in general means I just sort of take some claims as basic, and they're not really up for rational argumentation in my mind. There are going to be some people who hear that and think I've kind of sold out as a philosopher or something. I'm just being honest here. I'm not going to debate like the existence of God. I just kind of take it as a given. And there are weird specific claims that you find made by historical Christianity that I basically accept. That said, if you wanted to ask some questions about some big debates, not a utilitarian, I'm not a Kantian. I have a strong affinity for virtue ethics. I'm a moral realist of some kind, probably the naturalist variety, generally a metaphysical realist as well. Sorry, I had to knock a cat away. I'm generally a metaphysical realist, and I have a lot of affinities actually for philosophical skepticism and think that it can be overcome, but in weird ways. And I think that skepticism is one of the most interesting fields or sort of topics that has reoccurred in the history of philosophy. And so I would say, bundle all of those together, sympathetic to philosophical skepticism, yet, however, kind of overcoming that based on some other philosophical and extra philosophical claims, generally a realist about stuff. I've never really had strong anti-realist opinions or leanings, which is probably actually why skepticism can actually seem more plausible to me. You kind of have to want realism to be true to think that skepticism is an issue. Other people ask me about my favorite books ever. That's really, really tough because books is a really big category. I could say if I'm just rattling off a couple of novels, A Canticle for Leibowitz is one of my favorites. Crime and Punishment. There would probably be something by Haruki Murakami if we were going to make that into the list. The problem is I think Ursula K. Le Guin is like in my top 3 authors. I don't know if any one of her books makes it into my top 3 or even top 5, but her corpus is just so astounding that all of it taken together just sort of flings her up near the top of any list of authors. For philosophy, After Virtue, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and maybe Augustine's Confessions would be in my top 3. But Hume's treatise, as I've talked about before here, just an astounding work. The Inquiry, also astounding. Hume is great. I have a feeling someone in the comments will ask me why I didn't pick Thomas Aquinas's Summa. The answer for that is I haven't read all of it because it's really big, and also that I'm not much of a Thomist when it comes to philosophy or theology, but I recognize that it's a monumental work that's truly great, but probably just not going to make it to the top of any list. Okay, one really great question was why someone with limited time should care about reading all these books, and why shouldn't they just listen to lectures, watch YouTube videos, something like that? My answer is you should do both of those things. Sometimes a lecture or a YouTube video will be more useful for you than a book. Not always. And I don't think your sort of intellectual diet should only consist in lectures and YouTube videos. However, my wife loves Wondrium or the great courses. She listens to lots of courses about great composers, and then she goes and listens to the music with a new appreciation. I think that's a great use of something like that. And reading a book there, I don't know if there's necessarily a value to reading a book as opposed to listening to a lecture in that case. One thing, though, that you should say about books is that books have certain features that these lectures and YouTube videos don't. You can't really read a book in the background. You can't just have it as noise. A lot of those lectures and YouTube videos can become that. I know because I do this. It's how I listen to audiobooks sometimes, how I listen to some podcasts, how I watch YouTube videos, because I'm mostly watching with the screen turned off. So books require a certain amount of concentration and focus, and I actually think those train the mind in a nice way. And so reading books is just a good thing to do, regardless of the content, actually. And then reading books with good content is even better. That said, if you have limited time, you should do what works for you in your schedule. I'm not here to tell you that you should feel bad about the fact that you can't read even 15 books a year, 12 books a year, a book a month or something. I want you to do what actually fits into your schedule. One of the virtues of being so influenced by Aristotle's Ethics is that I can say lots of things depend on the particularities of a circumstance, and how a virtuous person would respond actually depends on those particularities as well. And so we can't come up with hard and fast rules like anyone who isn't reading, 24 books a year, so 2 a month or something, just isn't doing a good job or something. I'd say do what you can. Push yourself a little bit, try to read maybe a little bit more than you initially feel comfortable with. Set a goal that's maybe just a tiny bit too high. Don't feel too bad if you don't make it, because actually the striving and the attempt was one of the reasons that it was so important. There are products that will purport to sell you summaries of books, and I highly discourage those. Listening to a lecture is a little bit different because they are providing an analysis. They can place it in history, for instance. You're going to get more stuff. Just reading a condensed version of something or listening to a synopsis, I think you basically get none of the benefits of the book, of the experience of reading, of listening to a lecture, anything like that. So not a big fan of those synopses. One question that came up in relation to my commonplace book video and a few others, when I've mentioned that I like to read physical books now, stuff like that, was why don't I use something like a personal knowledge management system like Obsidian or Rome Research or something like that? I've tried those, actually. I was an early supporter of Rome Research, and I have financially contributed to Obsidian. Because I think that some parts of those products are really cool. I'm probably more pro Obsidian these days. Just as a note, I think it's a good product. I like that there's a free version available to everyone. The reason I don't use those things, and the reason I read fewer books on my Kindle, for instance, is just that I want to get away from screens. I work in tech. I now make YouTube videos. I just got to get away from screens. So I just try to do my reading away from screens whenever I can. I also just like the experience of writing by hand and writing notes like that. I think that you process better when you write by hand rather than typing or trying to get things into some kind of software or using an app. And so it's just what works for me. And it's generally the approach I would advocate, while also admitting that there will be exceptions and people have to figure things out for themselves. there's always going to be that disclaimer for anything I recommend here, right? Is that, circumstances vary, so adapt as needed. But in general, I like physical books. I like physical notes. And I would say you should give it a shot. And then finally, there's kind of a big topic I want to address. And it was never explicitly asked in the Q&A thread, but has been brought up in some of the comments. And the question is, why do we only talk about books from the West on this channel? Why don't we talk about things like Indian philosophy, which is something a lot of commenters have asked about? Or why don't we talk about, Chinese philosophy or something? Don't we feel that like the Western canon and even understood a little broadly like we do it here is a little limiting? And it's true that there is a limit here. We have placed a boundary on the contents of this channel. There are sort of two main reasons to do what we've done. One of them is just that this is a niche that I don't think a lot of people on YouTube were seeing. I know there are people who talk about like classic books or something. We just saw an opportunity and maybe thought there would be an audience, for our specific focus, right? And so when I was talking, I sort of came up with the idea for this podcast. The YouTube channel kind of grew out organically out of it. And I just thought it was a good theme. It was a good selling point. Classic books from the Western canon. There are people who are interested in like classically educating their kids. There are people who just want to read more of the canon. There are people who are like skeptical of the canon, but might be convinced. And I just thought that's a good group. It's a wide enough group. It's a diverse enough group that we could talk about it. I even kind of think that there might be two main camps of people who would benefit. One of these are people from the West who just haven't engaged deeply with this large kind of broad Western tradition and would benefit from learning more about kind of the cultural artifacts that have shaped and formed the world that they live in. And then there would be this other group of people who weren't from the West. And that's the advantage of being on the internet, right? Is that we can all interact, who would maybe want to learn a little bit about Western literature coming from their own perspective. And I thought that could be really healthy. But why don't I ever talk about like Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy, right? It's actually, I do it out of respect. I don't think that I would be great at that. I don't have much of an education in it. I haven't read enough. I've read like a little bit of Chinese philosophy. I have read some like classical Islamic philosophers. Took one course like that in my undergraduate days. I've never read any Indian philosophy. And part of me is like a little ashamed about that. I should read more of this, right? And so while I personally have projects I want to pursue, I can't make content about something unless I think I could do a good job. And I actually think it would be worse if I tried to make videos about Indian philosophy, for instance, and then just kind of phoned it in or just did a bad job at it, because it wouldn't be respectful to those traditions. So I was thinking about the right way to bring this up, because I don't want to offend anybody. And I actually feel really good about the policy that I have. So, the content of the channel is just not going to change. We're just like not going to talk about a lot of non-Western sources. But people obviously have a hunger for it. So I'll just say this. If you know of another channel or podcast that's kind of doing what I'm doing, but doing it for non-Western philosophers, whether that's someone working specifically on Islamic philosophy, specifically on Indian philosophy, maybe Jewish philosophy. There's a philosophy channel called Seekers of Unity that does a bunch of like Jewish mysticism stuff, right? If you know of any channels like that, or just more channels in general, let me know about them. Post them in the comments. Put them in the comments of this video, and I'll boost them whenever I can. Like I'll mention them. I'll point people in their direction when they ask me about it. And my thought is, we can kind of divide the labor up. Right? You don't need one channel to talk about everything. You need lots of channels that talk about specific things and always do it well. And so I'd love to see more people talking about classics of Indian philosophy or talking about Chinese philosophy on YouTube. And in fact, it might exist. The algorithm has never pointed me in the direction of high quality sources like that. But I haven't done too much digging either, right? So all I would say there is we are going to talk about the Western canon. We're going to talk about Western philosophers, stuff like that. But that isn't meant to denigrate or imply somehow that these other traditions are kind of lesser than. They are their own beautiful, great, interesting, rich traditions, and we should respect them. And one of the ways that we respect them is by letting experts, or at least educated amateurs, be the ones to sort of guide the discussion. Okay, that already went a little bit longer than I thought it would, so I think I should end it here. Check out the podcast. Be on the lookout for more videos. Maybe subscribe if you haven't. If you give us a like, we really appreciate that too. Let me know what you think in the comments. All of that stuff that YouTubers are supposed to say. All right, I'll talk to you next time.